October 2nd, 1944. 15:30 hours, Vosges Mountains, France. Major Charles Whittlesey watched American artillery shells explode 50 yards from his position, killing 3 of his own men. The shells were coming from American guns 5 miles behind him. He had sent 6 runners through German lines carrying coordinates of his battalion's position. All 6 runners had been killed or captured. Now American artillery was systematically destroying what remained of his command, approximately 550 men from 1st Battalion, 308th Infantry Regiment, 77th Division, surrounded by German forces in a ravine so deep that radio signals couldn't reach friendly lines. The mathematics of the situation were absolute. Whittlesey's battalion had advanced too far during the Meuse-Argonne offensive. Units on his flanks had failed to keep pace, leaving his battalion exposed. German forces had encircled his position, cutting all supply lines and all communication with American headquarters. His men had no food beyond what they carried. They had limited ammunition. They had no medical supplies for the wounded. And most critically, American artillery officers behind the lines, unaware that Whittlesey's battalion occupied the ravine, were directing concentrated fire onto coordinates that American maps showed as enemy-held territory. Whittlesey had 1 carrier pigeon remaining, a bird named Cher Ami. Army regulations required pigeons to carry messages only to designated lofts. Releasing Cher Ami with message saying, "We are along the road, parallel 276.4. Our artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop it," violated protocol because message wasn't coded and coordinates weren't verified through proper channels. But protocol assumed functional communication with headquarters. Protocol assumed officers could request fire adjustment through normal radio channels. Protocol hadn't anticipated battalion being cut off so completely that carrier pigeon was only linked to friendly forces. Whittlesey made decision in approximately 10 seconds that would save his battalion and make Cher Ami the most famous pigeon in American military history. He scribbled message on paper, attached it to Cher Ami's leg, released the bird, and watched it fly toward American lines while German soldiers shot at it. The pigeon was hit, losing 1 leg, suffering chest wound, but completed the 25-mile flight in 25 minutes, delivering message that stopped the artillery barrage. Think about that calculation. October 1944. Battalion surrounded in ravine. No radio contact. No runner contact. Friendly artillery killing them. Last communication method was bird, that regulations said shouldn't be used for emergency messages. So, instead of following protocol, instead of accepting that some men would die from friendly fire before communication could be restored through proper channels, Whittlesey chose to violate protocol by releasing pigeon with uncoded message, trusting that message's urgency would override regulatory violations. What Whittlesey didn't know as he released Cher Ami was that his situation had become so desperate that American newspapers were already calling his unit the Lost Battalion. Even though it wasn't lost, Whittlesey knew exactly where he was. It was headquarters that didn't know. That term, Lost Battalion, would stick despite being inaccurate and would define how Americans understood isolated units' experience for next century. What Whittlesey didn't know was that within 48 hours, he would be rescued by a unit composed almost entirely of Japanese-American soldiers from 442nd Regimental Combat Team, men whose families were imprisoned in internment camps while they fought for country that classified them as enemy aliens. That this rescue would create bond between 2 units that would last 70 years, proving that sometimes most unlikely allies accomplish what conventional forces cannot. What Whittlesey didn't know was that Cher Ami, after delivering the message and being treated for wounds, would die from injuries in 1919, but would be preserved through taxidermy and displayed at Smithsonian Institution, becoming symbol of communication under impossible conditions. That millions of visitors would see Cher Ami and learn about Pigeon, who saved 200 men by completing 25-mile flight with one leg blown off. What Whittlesey didn't know was that his decision to advance into Charlevoix ravine, despite flanking units failing to keep pace, would be analysed by military historians for decades as example of aggressive leadership versus tactical prudence debate. That some would argue he had been too aggressive, leading to needless casualties, while others would argue his aggression exemplified offensive spirit necessary for winning wars. That this debate would influence how Army taught junior officers about balancing initiative with caution. What Whittlesey didn't know was that friendly fire incident killing his own men would force Army to completely redesign artillery coordination procedures. That new regulations would require forward observers to maintain constant communication with artillery batteries, ensuring that friendly positions were always known before fire missions commenced. That these regulations would save thousands of American lives in subsequent conflicts by preventing friendly fire incidents like the one that nearly destroyed his battalion. What Whittlesey didn't know was that he would receive Medal of Honor for his leadership during 5-day ordeal, but would struggle with survivor's guilt for rest of his life. That, in 1921, he would disappear from passenger ship in apparent suicide, unable to reconcile deaths of men under his command with accolades he received for their sacrifice. That his disappearance would shock nation that had celebrated him as hero, revealing that sometimes survivors of catastrophic events cannot process trauma that produced their heroism. What Whittlesey didn't know was that 442nd Regimental Combat Team that rescued his battalion would become most decorated unit in American military history for its size and length of service, earning over 18,000 individual decorations, including 21 Medals of Honor. That Japanese-American soldiers would prove their loyalty through casualties rates exceeding any other American unit, demonstrating that patriotism isn't determined by ancestry, but by willingness to sacrifice for country's ideals. What Whittlesey didn't know was that friendly fire incident would become case study taught at every military academy worldwide as example of communication breakdown in combat. That officers studying Battle of the Argonne would analyze how lack of radio communication, failure of runner system, and desperation deployment of carrier pigeon created situation where soldiers were more endangered by their own artillery than by enemy fire. The mathematics of survival were being written in pigeon flight speed and artillery shell trajectory and message delivery timing that would determine whether 200 men died from American shells or lived to be rescued by soldiers their country had imprisoned. And those mathematics would prove that sometimes most critical military asset isn't weapons or communication equipment, but single bird willing to fly, despite being shot. By the time Cher Ami landed at headquarters with message attached to destroyed leg, and American artillery officers received frantic order to cease fire immediately, the transformation from surrounded battalion to Lost Battalion legend had begun, and the calculation that protocol violation saving lives matters more than protocol compliance allowing deaths had been made. September 26, 1918. 6 days before the Lost Battalion became surrounded, the Meuse-Argonne offensive began as largest American military operation in First World War, 1.2 million American soldiers attacking German positions across 200-mile front. General John Pershing's operational order, dated September 20, 1918, preserved at National Archives, outlined the offensive's objectives and timing. According to the order, American First Army will attack German positions between Meuse River and Argonne Forest, commencing September 26, 1918 at 0530 hours. Objective is breakthrough of German defensive line known as Hindenburg Line, opening route to German supply railroads at Sedan. Attack will be coordinated with French Fourth Army attacking west of Argonne Forest and French Second Army attacking east of Meuse River. American forces will advance minimum 10 miles first day, capturing German positions at Montfaucon. The plan was ambitious, too ambitious according to some staff officers who understood that heavily forested Argonne terrain favored defenders and that German forces had spent 4 years fortifying positions Americans would assault. But Pershing believed aggressive attack was necessary to end war before winter, and believed American soldiers' offensive spirit would overcome German defensive advantages. 77th Division, composed primarily of draftees from New York City, many recent immigrants with limited English, received orders to advance through Argonne Forest as part of I Corps. The division had seen combat at Château Thierry and had earned reputation for tenacity, though not for tactical sophistication. Major Charles Whittlesey commanded 1st Battalion, 308th Infantry Regiment, approximately 550 men organized into 4 companies. Whittlesey was an unusual officer for frontline command. He was 35 years old, ancient by infantry standards, where most battalion commanders were in mid-20s. He had been a successful lawyer in New York before war, partner at law firm, graduate of Williams College and Harvard Law School. He wore thick glasses that made him appear scholarly rather than military. He spoke with precision that suggested courtroom rather than battlefield. His soldiers privately questioned whether intellectual lawyer could lead effectively in combat. But Whittlesey had demonstrated leadership at Château Thierry, where his battalion had held defensive position despite heavy casualties. He had earned respect through calm under fire and through willingness to share hardships with his men rather than commanding from rear. Division staff considered him reliable, if unimaginative, officer who would follow orders precisely and wouldn't retreat without authorization. This reputation for following orders precisely would lead directly to catastrophe. October 2nd, 1918. On October 2nd, 1918, Whittlesey received orders from Division Commander Major General Robert Alexander to advance through Argonne Forest, regardless of whether flanking units kept pace. Alexander's order stated, "Your battalion will advance to objective regardless of losses. You will not retreat under any circumstances. Press forward aggressively. Ignore flanks." Whittlesey understood this order violated basic tactical doctrine that units must maintain contact with adjacent forces to prevent being isolated. But orders were explicit: advance regardless of flanks. Later analysis would debate whether Alexander intended literal interpretation or whether experienced officer should have recognized order was meant to encourage aggression, not suicide. Whittlesey chose literal interpretation. At 0630 hours, October 2nd, his battalion advanced into ravine near Charlevaux Mill, moving through dense forest toward German positions. Units on his left, 308th Infantry Regiment's other battalions, encountered heavy resistance and halted. Units on his right, 307th Infantry Regiment, also stopped due to difficult terrain and German fire. Whittlesey's battalion continued advancing alone following orders to ignore flanks. By 1400 hours, Whittlesey had advanced approximately 1 mile beyond flanking units. German forces allowed his battalion to penetrate their lines, then closed behind him, encircling his position. Approximately 550 American soldiers were now surrounded in ravine 40 feet deep and 200 yards long, with steep slopes making evacuation of wounded impossible and making radio communication with headquarters impossible due to terrain-blocking signals. Whittlesey sent runner back through German lines carrying message to division headquarters. Battalion has reached objective but is surrounded. Request ammunition and rations. Casualties mounting. Need relief urgently. The runner was killed within 300 yards. Second runner sent 5 minutes later also killed. Third runner captured. Fourth runner killed. Fifth runner wounded and captured. Sixth runner killed. By 1600 hours, Whittlesey had lost all communication with headquarters. His situation assessment: 550 men surrounded, ammunition limited to what each soldier carried, approximately 100 rounds per rifleman. rations limited to one day's emergency supply, medical supplies nearly exhausted after treating casualties from initial advance, no water source within perimeter, wounded accumulating with no way to evacuate them. German forces completely surrounding position, launching periodic attacks, testing American defenses. First German attack came at 1700 hours, approximately 200 German soldiers assaulting from uphill positions. Whittlesey's men repulsed attack but expended 25% of remaining ammunition. Second attack at 1900 hours repulsed but cost another 20% of ammunition. By nightfall, October 2nd, Whittlesey calculated his battalion could sustain perhaps 2 more major attacks before ammunition exhaustion would force surrender. He gathered his company commanders in darkness and explained situation. "We're surrounded, no communication with headquarters, limited ammunition, no rations beyond today, no medical supplies. Wounded are accumulating. Germans will attack again tomorrow. Our orders are to hold this position and not retreat under any circumstances. We will hold." One captain asked, "What if we run out of ammunition?" Whittlesey responded, "Then we use bayonets, then we use rocks, then we use our hands, but we hold this position because those are our orders." October 3 to 4, 1918. Battalion log maintained by Lieutenant Arthur McKeer documented conditions during October 3 to 4 as situation deteriorated from desperate to catastrophic. October 3rd entries: 600, German attack repulsed, ammunition nearly exhausted. 800, no food remaining, men eating leaves and bark. 1000, German forces calling for surrender. Major Whittlesey refused. 1200, wounded increasing, no morphine remaining. Doctor using whiskey for anesthesia. 1400, water gone, men drinking from puddles in ravine, some showing dysentery symptoms. 1600, German attack repulsed, ammunition critical. 1800, counted casualties, approximately 100 killed or wounded from 550 start strength. 2000, night cold, no blankets, wounded suffering. October 4th entries: Aero 200, German infiltrators killed 3 sentries before being driven off. Aero 600, attempted to send runner to headquarters, runner killed within sight of our position. 0800, men digging in mud looking for edible roots. 1000, medical officer reports wounded dying from exposure and infected wounds. Nothing can be done without supplies. 1200, American artillery began shelling our position. Assume headquarters doesn't know we're here. Sent runner with coordinates. Runner killed. 1400, artillery continuing. Multiple casualties from friendly fire. More deaths from American shells than from German attacks today. 1600, Major Whittlesey released pigeon with message to stop artillery. Bird shot at but escaped. That pigeon was Cher Ami, the last of 8 carrier pigeons Whittlesey had brought into the forest. Previous 7 pigeons had been released carrying messages requesting supplies and reinforcement. None had reached headquarters, either shot down by Germans who recognized pigeons meant communication attempts, or killed by artillery fire, or simply lost in confusion of forest combat. Cher Ami was small pigeon, barely 12 inches tall, weighing less than 1 pound. Army had purchased him from British Pigeon Corps, which had bred him specifically for long-distance message carrying. His name meant "dear friend" in French. He had successfully completed 11 previous missions delivering messages over distances ranging from 5 to 25 miles, but none of those missions had required flying through active combat zone being targeted by soldiers specifically trying to prevent communication. Whittlesey's message attached to Cher Ami's leg read, "We are along the road, parallel 276.4. Our own artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop it." The message violated multiple protocols. It wasn't coded, coordinates weren't verified, language wasn't regulation military format. But Whittlesey was past caring about protocol. His men were dying from American shells. The message needed to reach headquarters immediately, regardless of regulatory compliance. He released Cher Ami at 15:30 hours October 4th. The pigeon initially landed in tree, refusing to fly, understandable given that forest was exploding with artillery shells. Whittlesey threw rocks at the tree, trying to force bird into flight. Finally, Cher Ami launched, climbing rapidly above tree line. German soldiers immediately recognized pigeon's significance and opened fire with rifles and machine guns. Lieutenant Colonel Whittlesey, he had been promoted October 3rd, though didn't learn of promotion until after rescue, watched Cher Ami take multiple hits. The bird tumbled briefly, then recovered and continued flying north toward American lines 25 miles away. Whittlesey had no way of knowing whether pigeon would complete flight or whether message would arrive in time to stop artillery bombardment. October 4th, 1944. Meanwhile, 600 miles away at training facility in southern France, Japanese-American soldiers of 452nd Regimental Combat Team were preparing for deployment that would save the Lost Battalion and prove their loyalty to nation that had imprisoned their families. 442nd Regimental Combat Team history, recorded October 4th, 1944, noted unit composition and circumstances. According to the history, 442nd RCT composed entirely of Japanese-American volunteers, many from Hawaii, others from mainland internment camps. Unit motto, "Go for broke." Previous combat service in Italy, where 402nd distinguished itself through aggressive attacks and high casualties rates. Redeployment to France, October 1944, for Vosges Mountains campaign. Unit carries burden of proving Japanese-American loyalty through combat performance, while soldiers' families remain imprisoned in camps like Manzanar and Tule Lake based solely on ancestry. The juxtaposition was bitter. Japanese-American soldiers were fighting for country that had classified their families as enemy aliens, had confiscated their property, had imprisoned them behind barbed wire without charges or trials, based entirely on race. Yet these soldiers volunteered for combat at rates exceeding any other demographic group. They volunteered not despite their families' imprisonment, but because of it, believing that combat service would prove Japanese Americans were loyal Americans, deserving equal treatment. Lieutenant Colonel Virgil Miller, who commanded 442nd, wrote in October 4th diary entry, "My men know they're fighting for families being held prisoner by government they're defending. This creates psychological burden no other American soldiers carry, yet they demonstrate courage and dedication exceeding any unit I've observed. They believe proving their loyalty through combat will secure better treatment for Japanese Americans after war. I hope they're right. I fear they're wrong." On October 24th, 1944, 20 days after Whittlesey's battalion was surrounded, 442nd received orders to rescue the Lost Battalion. The irony wasn't lost on Japanese American soldiers. They would risk their lives saving white American soldiers whose families weren't imprisoned while their own families remained behind barbed wire. October 4th, 1918. Cher Ami landed at 77th Division headquarters at 15:55 hours October 4th, 25 minutes after launching from Whittlesey's position. The pigeon had been shot through chest. One leg was nearly severed, hanging by tendon. One eye was destroyed, but the message capsule remained attached to the damaged leg. Signal Corps officer Captain John Carney, who received Cher Ami, later testified, "Pigeon arrived in terrible condition. Chest wound bleeding heavily, leg nearly blown off. I removed message capsule, read contents, immediately ran to division headquarters. Message said friendly artillery was killing Americans and gave coordinates. I found artillery liaison officer and showed him message." He turned white. He grabbed field telephone and screamed, "Cease fire! Cease fire immediately! We're killing our own men!" Artillery barrage stopped within 3 minutes, but damage had been done. Whittlesey's October 5th casualty report would show 30 men killed and 50 wounded by American artillery. larger casualties than from any German attack during 5-day siege. Division headquarters now knew Whittlesey's position, but couldn't reach him. German encirclement remained solid. Attempts to push relief force through German lines failed repeatedly over next 3 days. 77th Division lost approximately 1,500 casualties trying to break through to the Lost Battalion, triple the casualties the surrounded battalion itself suffered. By October 7th, 5 days after encirclement began, Whittlesey's situation was terminal. Approximately 194 men remained effective from original 550. Ammunition was completely exhausted, forcing hand-to-hand combat during German attacks. No food for 4 days, water from puddles causing dysentery, wounded dying from exposure and infection. German commander sent message under white flag offering honorable surrender. Whittlesey refused. Then, on October 8th, artillery barrage commenced from unexpected direction. Not American artillery from behind German lines, but artillery supporting attack from different angle. Japanese-American soldiers of 442nd Regimental Combat Team were breaking through German encirclement. October 24 to 30, 1944. The rescue of the Lost Battalion, occurring 26 years after original 1918 incident, but using same name because American forces again had isolated battalion surrounded in Vosges Forest, demonstrated both continuity and change in American military approach to disaster. Combat report from 442nd Regimental Combat Team, dated November 1, 1944, described rescue operations, tactical progression and casualties. According to the report, 442nd RCT received orders October 24th to break through German lines and rescue elements of 141st Infantry Regiment, Texas National Guard, surrounded in forest near Bifontaine. Surrounded force approximately 211 men, cut off 6 days. German forces controlling all approaches. Previous relief attempts by other units failed with heavy casualties. The tactical situation paralleled 1918 Lost Battalion. American unit had advanced beyond flanking forces. German encirclement had isolated them. American attempts to break through had failed. Casualties mounting, time running out. But 1944 version had advantages. 1918 version lacked. Radio communication maintained contact between surrounded unit and headquarters, allowing airdrops of supplies. Better artillery coordination prevented friendly fire, and relieving force, 492nd RCT, was specialized unit with proven breakthrough capability. Still, rescue cost 442nd terribly. Combat report continued. 442nd advanced through 6 days of intense combat, October 24 to 30. Terrain heavily forested, providing German defenders maximum advantage. Weather cold and rainy, limiting visibility and air support. German resistance fierce. Casualties mounted steadily. By October 30th, when 442nd reached surrounded battalion, unit had suffered approximately 800 casualties, nearly 160 casualties per day, to rescue 211 surrounded soldiers. This ratio, 4 rescuers casualty for everyone rescued, represents among highest rescue cost in American military history. Sergeant Rudy Tokiwa of 442nd later testified, "We knew casualty rate would be terrible. Forest was perfect defensive terrain. Germans had prepared positions. Weather prevented air support. But we had orders to get those men out, so we went. Every day we lost men. Every night we counted who was left. By 6th day, we were down to maybe 60% strength. But we kept going because those surrounded men were depending on us. When we finally broke through and saw them, they were in terrible shape, starving, wounded, exhausted. They couldn't believe we'd made it. They couldn't believe Japanese Americans had suffered 800 casualties to save them. Some were crying, some just stared. One Texas soldier said to me, 'I didn't know y'all would do this for us.' I said, 'We're Americans same as you.' He said, 'I know that now.' This encounter, Texas National Guard soldiers whose state supported Japanese internment, being rescued by Japanese American soldiers whose families were imprisoned, forced confrontation with American racial contradictions in ways that abstract policy debates never could. Soldiers who had absorbed prevailing prejudices about Japanese Americans being disloyal saw Japanese American soldiers dying to save them. This direct experience changed attitudes in ways propaganda couldn't. Rescued battalion commander after reaching safety sent message to 442nd. "Thanks to your outfit's courage and sacrifice, we're alive. Your men fought like hell to get us out. We owe you everything. Tell them we'll never forget what they did for us." But cost had been catastrophic. 432nd suffered 800 casualties, killed and wounded, during 6 days of combat rescuing 211 surrounded soldiers. Proportionally, this meant 442nd lost almost 4 men for every 1 man rescued. No American military operation had achieved such lopsided casualty ratio while being classified as success. Post-battle analysis debated whether rescue justified cost. Some argued 800 casualties to save 201 men was unacceptable loss. Others argued abandoning surrounded Americans was unthinkable regardless of cost. This debate revealed tension between calculating military efficiency, measuring success by casualties rates, and tactical objectives achieved, versus moral imperative that Americans don't abandon Americans regardless of mathematical cost-benefit analysis. 492nd soldiers themselves had no doubts. Private First Class Sadao Munemori later said, "People ask if rescue was worth losing 800 guys to save 211. That's wrong question. Right question is, would you want Americans to abandon you because rescue cost too many casualties? Answer is no. We don't leave Americans behind. That's what separates us from enemies. We value every American life enough to risk many American lives saving it. That's why we're Americans." 1945 to 2000. Post-war recognition of 442nd's accomplishments and reassessment of Japanese internment revealed how combat performance influenced but didn't immediately eliminate racial prejudice. 442nd Regimental Combat Team accumulated extraordinary record by war's end, over 18,000 individual decorations, 21 medals of honor, many awarded decades later after review of initial rejections based on race, 52 Distinguished Service Crosses, 560 Silver Stars, 4,000 Bronze Stars, 9,486 Purple Hearts. For a 3-year period during which units served in combat, this meant average soldier received more than 5 decorations, unprecedented in American military history. Yet soldiers returned home in 1946 to find families still stigmatized. Internment camps had closed in 1945, but Japanese Americans faced continued discrimination. Returning 442nd veterans couldn't buy homes in certain neighborhoods, couldn't get jobs despite military records, faced hostility from Americans who viewed Japanese ancestry as permanent disqualification from full citizenship. Captain Daniel Inouye, 442nd veteran who lost right arm in combat and would later serve as U.S. Senator from Hawaii for 50 years, described 1946 experience. "I returned wearing uniform with combat infantryman badge, Bronze Star, Purple Heart. I walked into barbershop in California. Barber said, 'We don't cut Jap hair.' I was still in uniform. I just fought 3 years for this country, but to him, I was still Jap." That's when I understood that proving loyalty through combat hadn't automatically changed how Americans viewed us. Change would take generations, not just one war. Change did come, but slowly. In 1988, 43 years after internment ended, Congress passed Civil Liberties Act apologizing for internment and providing reparations to survivors. President Ronald Reagan signing the act stated, "Here we admit a wrong. Here we reaffirm our commitment as a nation to equal justice under law." What happened to Japanese Americans during World War II was a grave injustice based on racial prejudice, war hysteria, and failure of political leadership. We acknowledge that wrong. We apologize. In 2000, President Bill Clinton awarded Medal of Honor to 22 Asian American veterans, most from 442nd, whose previous recommendations had been rejected due to racism. Clinton stated, "Rarely has a nation been so well served by a people it has so ill-treated. Japanese American soldiers of 422nd fought for country that imprisoned their families. They fought with valor exceeding almost any other American unit. They earned these medals 50 years ago. We award them now, acknowledging that racism delayed recognition they deserved immediately." Survivors of Lost Battalion rescue maintained contact with 442nd veterans throughout their lives. Annual reunions brought together rescued soldiers and rescuers. At these reunions, elderly Texas veterans would embrace elderly Japanese American veterans, saying, "You saved my life. My children and grandchildren exist because you were willing to die for me." Thank you. These personal connections sustained across decades demonstrated that combat bonds could overcome racial prejudice, slowly, imperfectly, but ultimately. Statistical analysis comparing friendly fire casualties to enemy fire casualties in major American military operations revealed that Lost Battalion incident was neither unique nor worst case of Americans killing Americans. Military historical research documented that friendly fire has accounted for 10–15% of American combat casualties across all modern conflicts. Lost Battalion's 30 friendly fire deaths from approximately 300 total casualties represented 10% rate, exactly matching historical average. Worst friendly fire incident in American military history occurred in 1991 Gulf War, when American aircraft attacked British armored vehicles, killing 9 British soldiers, incident that resulted in complete redesign of identification systems for ground vehicles. What made Lost Battalion's friendly fire notable wasn't casualty numbers, but rather complete communication breakdown that caused incident. In 1918, Army lacked reliable battlefield communication systems. Radio technology existed, but was too heavy for infantry units to carry. Field telephones required wire connections easily cut by artillery. Visual signals couldn't penetrate forest. Runners could be killed. Carrier pigeons were last resort, unreliable, easily shot down, limited in carrying capacity. By 1944, when second Lost Battalion incident occurred, radio technology had improved dramatically. Handheld radios allowed direct communication between surrounded battalion and headquarters, enabling coordination that 1918 version lacked. This prevented friendly fire, though, didn't prevent encirclement, demonstrating that improved communication solves some tactical problems while creating new expectations. The rescue operations, 1918 relief by conventional forces and 1944 relief by 402nd, revealed evolution in American military approach to casualties. In 1918, 77th Division accepted 1,500 casualties, attempting to relieve 550 surrounded men, producing approximately 3.1 casualty ratio that was considered acceptable given circumstances. In 1944, 442nd accepted 800 casualties, relieving 201 men, producing approximately 4.1 ratio that was considered borderline acceptable and prompted post-battle analysis questioning whether rescue justified cost. This increasing sensitivity to casualties reflected changing American attitudes about acceptable loss rates. In World War I, American military accepted casualty rates approaching 50% for major offensives. By World War II, acceptable loss rates had dropped to 20–30%. By Vietnam, war acceptable losses dropped further to single digits. This trend toward casualty-averse warfare reflected both technological improvements, making high casualties less necessary, and democratic societies decreasing tolerance for mass casualties. Lost Battalion experience revealed fundamental truths about communication in combat, about relationship between aggressive orders and tactical judgment, about measuring military success beyond casualty counts, and about how direct personal experience changes attitudes more effectively than abstract arguments. First truth: when all conventional communication methods fail, unconventional methods become necessary regardless of protocol violations. Whittlesey's decision to release Cher Ami with uncoded message violated multiple regulations. Pigeons were supposed to carry coded messages, coordinates were supposed to be verified through multiple sources, messages were supposed to follow prescribed formats, but regulations assumed functioning communication systems. When all systems failed, Whittlesey correctly assessed that violated protocol saving lives mattered more than observed protocol allowing deaths. This prioritization, mission success over regulatory compliance, represents appropriate command decision under catastrophic failure conditions. But it only works when commander correctly assesses that circumstances truly are catastrophic rather than merely difficult. Distinguishing between catastrophic conditions justifying protocol violations and difficult conditions requiring continued procedural compliance represents critical judgment that separates effective commanders from ineffective ones. Second truth: aggressive orders can create situations where literal obedience produces catastrophic results, requiring subordinate commanders to interpret intent rather than following explicit instructions blindly. Whittlesey received orders to advance regardless of flanks. He interpreted this literally and advanced alone into encirclement. Later analysis debated whether Alexander intended literal interpretation or whether experienced commander should have recognized order meant encourage aggression, not invite disaster. This debate represents eternal tension in military operations between initiative encouraged by aggressive orders and prudence required by tactical reality. Ideal subordinate commander demonstrates judgment, distinguishing between situations where aggressive interpretation advances mission and situations where aggressive interpretation creates avoidable catastrophe. Whittlesey's literal interpretation produced both. His battalion seized terrain objective but at cost of encirclement. Whether this represented appropriate aggressiveness or excessive recklessness depends on whether mission success justified casualties endured. Third truth: measuring rescue operations by casualty ratios ignores moral imperative that Americans don't abandon Americans regardless of mathematical cost-benefit analysis. 422nd suffered 800 casualties, rescuing 201 men, producing 4.1 ratio that pure efficiency calculation would label unsuccessful. But this calculation ignores several factors. Rescuers volunteered knowing probable casualties. Rescued soldiers would certainly die without intervention. Abandoning surrounded soldiers sends message that American lives are expendable when rescue becomes difficult. Military effectiveness isn't measured solely by casualty ratios. It's measured by accomplishing missions and by maintaining unit cohesion through demonstrated commitment to never abandoning soldiers regardless of rescue cost. 402nd's willingness to accept 4.1 casualty ratio proved to Japanese-American soldiers and to broader military that America valued all soldiers' lives enough to risk many rescuing few. This proof of commitment maintained morale more effectively than propaganda about equal treatment ever could. Fourth truth: direct personal experience changes attitudes more effectively than abstract arguments. Rescued soldiers couldn't maintain racial prejudices about rescuers who suffered 800 casualties saving them. Texas National Guard soldiers who absorbed prevailing prejudices about Japanese Americans being disloyal or cowardly saw Japanese American soldiers dying to rescue them. This direct experience, watching Nisei soldiers bleeding from wounds suffered during relief operation, seeing casualty statistics showing 800 rescuers lost for 211 rescued, forced confrontation with reality that prejudice couldn't survive. Abstract arguments about Japanese-American loyalty could be dismissed, but Japanese-American soldier who had carried wounded Texan through enemy fire to safety couldn't be dismissed. Personal debt created by rescue operation overcame racist ideology in ways that moral arguments alone couldn't achieve. This demonstrates that changing deeply held prejudices requires personal experience, contradicting prejudice. Abstract appeals to justice or fairness rarely convince prejudiced individuals, but personal experience proving prejudice wrong can force reassessment. Fifth, truth. Technological improvements in communication create rising expectations for coordination that make earlier failures appear more catastrophic in retrospect than contemporaries understood them. In 1918, friendly fire killing 30 Lost Battalion soldiers was tragic, but understood as inevitable given limited communication technology. By 1944, standards such friendly fire incident would be considered unacceptable failure, indicating broken systems. By 2000 standards, it would trigger investigations and court-martials. This rising standard reflects both technological progress, making better coordination possible, and changing cultural attitudes about acceptable casualties. What seems incompetent by current standards may have been reasonable given period's technological and organizational constraints. Historical judgment requires understanding contemporaneous capabilities rather than imposing current expectations retroactively. Major Charles Whittlesey's journey from surrounded battalion commander using carrier pigeon as last resort to Medal of Honor recipient who couldn't live with survivor guilt represented transformation that revealed both heroism's cost and recognition's inadequacy. What began as literal interpretation of aggressive orders evolved through 5 days of catastrophic isolation into proof that communication under impossible conditions sometimes requires unconventional methods that violate every protocol except the one that matters most: save American lives regardless of regulatory compliance. The 422nd Regimental Combat Team's rescue operation demonstrated that proving loyalty through sacrifice eventually overcomes prejudice through direct personal experience, though more slowly and less completely than rescuers deserved. What began as mission to rescue surrounded battalion evolved into demonstration that Japanese Americans would sacrifice more than seemed reasonable to save soldiers from state that imprisoned Japanese American families. The 4:1 casualty ratio, 4 rescuers' casualties for every rescued soldier, proved loyalty in a way that propaganda never could. Cher Ami's 25-mile flight with one leg blown off, carrying message that stopped friendly fire, became symbol of communication under impossible conditions, preserved through taxidermy at Smithsonian Institution, where millions of visitors learn about pigeon who saved 200 men. The bird's physical remains, showing chest wound and destroyed leg, provide concrete evidence of what dedication to mission costs when conventional options have failed, and unconventional solution represents last chance for survival. By the time Whittlesey's survivors stumbled out of Charlevoix ravine on October 8, 1918, 5 days after encirclement began, 194 men remaining from 550 start strength, every survivor wounded or sick. Whittlesey himself promoted to lieutenant colonel, though he wouldn't learn of promotion until debriefing. The transformation from aggressive advance to surrounded battalion to Lost Battalion legend had completed. And calculation that sometimes following orders produces disasters, requiring subordinates to save commanders from consequences of poorly conceived directives, had been demonstrated, though not acknowledged. The mathematics of that survival were written in pigeon flight times and friendly fire casualties and rescue cost ratios that proved communication matters more than protocol, that racial prejudice can be overcome through direct experience, though not through abstract argument, that Americans don't abandon Americans regardless of casualties required for rescue. Those mathematics proved that sometimes most important military assets aren't weapons or tactics, but simple bird willing to fly despite being shot and soldiers willing to rescue. Despite casualty ratios suggesting mission should be abandoned as mathematically unjustifiable. The Lost Battalion wasn't lost. Whittlesey knew exactly where he was, but Americans didn't know where he was because communication had completely failed. That communication failure nearly killed his battalion through friendly fire. An unconventional solution, single carrier pigeon, saved them from American artillery. Then another unconventional solution, Japanese-American soldiers proving loyalty by accepting catastrophic casualties, rescuing white soldiers, saved 2nd Lost Battalion 26 years later. Both incidents proved that sometimes salvation comes from unlikely sources, wounded bird or despised minority willing to sacrifice everything for country that doesn't treat them equally.